let's introduce you first to Greg de Hoedt. Greg is director of UK Cannabis Social Clubs. Now, that's the campaign to legalise cannabis. Greg, good morning to you.
Good morning,
You've been
Victoria.
smoking cannabis since you were 17. You're now 30. But since 2009, you've been using it for medicinal purposes because you've been diagnosed with Crohn's disease. You've broken UK drugs laws by using cannabis to help your condition. How do you feel about that?
I've had no other choice, really. I was given between 2 and 5 years left to live in 2010 because I had a Crohn's flare-up. That was even with the mild chemotherapy treatment that they were offering me. And for me, that wasn't acceptable, so I went to the United States. I accessed medical cannabis out there. I had to be a medical marijuana migrant, I think is the term they use, because I couldn't access it here. The pharmaceutical options aren't available here. So I accessed homegrown and dispensary oil in the US, and within 6 months I had a full bill of health. I came back to the UK, and that's when I started the UK Cannabis Social Clubs.
Right. And have you used it here in this country?
Yeah, I have to use it every single day. I can go into remission if I use cannabis daily. If I don't have access to it, I'll have a flare-up and I'll be in hospital, and they don't understand why I keep having those flare-ups. But when I tell them that it's the medication I take and I have access it to myself because I don't take their medication, it's it's not something they can offer me, so they don't feel like they can actually give me the help I need as a Crohn's patient.
But officially, you could be arrested, you could be fined, you could even be jailed for buying and using it, even for the purposes that you use it for. Unlikely to happen, of course, but theoretically, it could happen. What do you think about that?
I think it's quite sickening, really. Like a vulnerable person like myself, like in 2010, the first time I went out to buy cannabis after I came out of hospital, I was put into contact with someone I didn't know because no one I knew had anything, because that's the situation patients are in. They have to just go and find cannabis from wherever they can. And so I got passed on to someone else I didn't know, and I just had to trust them. I was on all sorts of opiate pharmaceuticals at the time that they just gave me in a bag and sent me home with just to take. So my state of mind wasn't great. I made the judgment to go and buy some cannabis off someone I didn't know, and I got mugged. I got taken out into a forest and had my money taken off me and put out there.
Really?
I just got out of hospital and told I'd had between 2 and 5 years left to live. And that's I even went to my politician, my MP, Henry Smith in Crawley, and asked him, will you support me? And
Which party is he from?
It's the Conservative Party, right. But his response was, my parents actually use it in California, and they have access to it over there, but I asked him, would you stand up for me in Parliament in 2010? He said, no, I'm sorry, this isn't important enough to our constituents.
Well, George Freeman is here. He's a Conservative MP. He's a former head of policy for Theresa May, a former Life Sciences Minister. Your party's been in power now for 8 years. What is taking you so long?
Well, I think this debate is building and the national mood is changing. I think we need to separate the medical from the recreational.
Which is what we're doing.
And personally, I think the medical case has been there for several years. When I was minister, I tried to open this up and get medical cannabis medicines licensed and regulated. Home Office wouldn't touch it. And I'm delighted that Sajid Javid has now done that.
You failed, and Home Secretary's failed, and Norman Lamb, you were in coalition, you were the Health Minister between 2012 and 2015, you also failed.
We couldn't get anywhere with the Conservatives. There was total resistance from Theresa May and the Home Office. We commissioned a study in the Treasury to see what tax revenues we would raise. It showed that it was over £1 billion. We commissioned a study in the Home Office from our minister there to find out whether there was any link internationally between having tough drug laws and reducing the use of drugs. Doesn't work at all internationally. The Home Office's own commissioned study, but the Tories would not look at the evidence. That was the shocking thing.
And that's Theresa May as Home Secretary.
Absolutely.
I think it's also, I think Norman would agree with this because we were both health ministers, it's also the Home Office institutionally, the civil service there, they simply would not countenance.
Don't blame the civil service. Come on, that is embarrassing.
I've accepted political responsibility, but there's also an institutional Whitehall responsibility.
And that's why you need politicians who will stand up to it.
Which is why I'm delighted that Sajid Javid, as Home Secretary, has broken this wall and said, listen, we acknowledge there are medical benefits of cannabis. Personally, I think we should very quickly licence and quickly make sure the patients that you heard about, those with brain cancer, with epilepsy, can access the drugs they need.
Are you ashamed it's taken so long for this review to be brought forward?
Ashame's a big word. I think the political class has been asleep, has been slow. I don't think it's just party politics. I think all of us have been too slow, and I welcome the fact that Sajid has broken this open and said, right, we're going to do medical cannabis now, and we're going to have a national debate about the wider use of cannabis.
He hasn't said we'll do medical cannabis now. That's actually what people like Greg, presumably you would want. He said there will be a review. Just why not just do it?
Listen, read the language. He said, very importantly, I'm talking days and weeks, not months. That's been my worry, that a big review in government could take months and years. He was very clear.
We don't have time to wait. We're patient.
Exactly.
I have epileptics. I've mothers with epileptic children contacting us. We have police officers, doctors, and nurses who are growing, cannabis for their parents who've got cancer. They ask us, what situation am I in growing my own? We need to have some kind of situation where they're decriminalised for those
completely
people.
right, and this is perfectly doable, by the way, Victoria. I used to be the minister for this. It's very simple. Take the regulation from Home Office to Health, and you simply say, listen, patients with these conditions, epilepsy, palsy, brain tumours, we know what the conditions are right now, have permission under licence right now to purchase, and very quickly put in place a registration scheme so that you can buy clean product. And terrible stories like you've just shared with us.
Victoria, I've got a constituent who takes cannabis as the only thing that relieves intense pain following a knee injury. He had his home raided. He's now been asked to attend the police station.
When did that happen? When was his home raided?
Last year.
Right.
He's been holding off going to the police station. He's now been told via me that if he doesn't attend voluntarily, he will be arrested.
Was he growing it or just...
No, he bought it on the web. Again, he was faced with this impossible dilemma. How do you get hold of it? He now faces getting a criminal record, which means he won't be able to visit his son in Australia. And he won't be able to get hold of the one thing that relieves pain. This is cruel and inhuman.
It's harassment of disabled people.
Sue Price.
I can't help but feel, present company accepted, that politicians are absolutely spineless when it comes to drug laws in this country. That many politicians, as indeed William Hague has done yesterday, sort of come out when they've left office. But when they're in office, before they're in office, like David Cameron talked about relaxing the laws, they all do this sort of more liberal approach. But when they're actually in office, they kind of hold the Home Office line or the tough on drugs.
Well, William Hague was never in office, but I take the point as leader of the Conservative Party. Let me bring in, I'll be with you in just one sec, Joseph. Next to you, Sue Price, Dr. Marta Di Fonte, psychiatrist and clinical academic, who's looked into the impact of cannabis on people's mental health. We've talked a little bit about the physical side of things. What about the mental health side of things?
Well, it depends if you want me to comment on the medical use of mental health or step into recreational. So in relation to the medical use, we had few studies, and the first sort of serious placebo double-blind trial was actually look as well at the possibility of using one of cannabis constituent to treat what I'm concerned about cannabis causes when it's used recreationally, which is psychosis. So even within mental health, cannabis could be exploited as a medication. I think my concern as a doctor, and I think I'm not sure how many medics there are in this panel, but is when we talk about medicinal cannabis, cannabis contains over 100 active ingredients. Which is the ingredient or the composition of ingredients we're talking about when we think to move towards people like me writing a prescription or recommending on daily amount depending from the condition. Now, my concern is that if we want to move to medical cannabis, rather than follow emotions, we need to know how to handle this properly. Because there are lots of people who have been self-medicating out there. Some get it right, some don't. And unfortunately, I do see in mental health the casualty of the one that got the wrong amount or they started at the wrong age.
So hang on. Yeah, absolutely. So as Norman Lamb says, these are the casualties of the existing position, but tell us what impact it's had on those examples that you've just given.
Well, for instance, I see young people who started using cannabis. I have to say 16 and 15-year-old and large don't self-medicate for medical condition.
No.
They use recreationally. And as a consequence of the type of cannabis available, especially in UK, and the police will be able to back me up, in London, which is primarily high potency, they develop mental health problems. And the one I see are the one that develop psychosis. So they come to mental health services with paranoia, as a consequence of that, drop out from school, withdraw from their friends, and really derail from that developmental pathway.
Baroness Molly Meacher, I mean, that must worry you.
It certainly does worry me, but I think it's very important to consider that across the Western world, psychotic illness has not increased over 50 years significantly.
Where are the evidence of this?
Just let me speak. But the point about this is that if you are in the early stages of psychosis, as you will know, you get negative symptoms, you feel very alienated. People in that situation often take cannabis, then later the florid symptoms come out, and then the assumption is this is because of the cannabis. You can get psychotic episodes while you're using very high THC.
With respect, Baroness
cannabis.
Meacher, our medic is disagreeing with you vigorously.
I have to disagree on 2 points. There is this myth that mental health, or let's talk about psychosis. Psychotic disorder rates have not increased. Well, the epidemiology of psychosis, it's not up to date. And there are actually recent evidence. There was a paper published in JAMA Psychiatrists who has shown rates of psychotic disorder in places like Amsterdam, Paris, and London. And the London rates, for instance, had definitely increased from the previous study, which was published in the late 90s, and from the main WHO study that was published 10 years earlier. So the issue of mental health rates not increasing, this is not true, and there is literature that is proving
Do
that.
respond, and then I'm...
And the other, very quickly, I think this is the usual chicken of the egg. There is, by all means, probably a proportion of people who are experiencing mental health symptoms of a variety, not just negative symptoms, who probably use cannabis and lots of other recreational drugs to self-medicate. But there is a huge body of longitudinal studies.
Okay, let Baroness
that
Meacher
have
respond, and then...
Can I say, as we know, there are these 2 key ingredients of cannabis. CBD is an antipsychotic. So long as, if you use it in a medicinal way, you would have a very careful balance between THC and CBD. CBD balances and controls the THC, and you will then have all the benefits of cannabis. As we know, millions, at least 1 million people could benefit from this, people like yourself. They could stay out of hospital. We would save not just 1 billion, several billion to the NHS if people with Crohn's, with chronic pain, severe pain, all these horrible illnesses and epilepsy, one hospital admission costs a lot of money.
Hang on. Greg is going to respond, and then Mr. Freeman, go.
I mean, like you've named 3 big overcrowded cities there. Like, I think mental health in overcrowded cities is quite high as it is, and I think we actually, as a result of that, should look at the societal factors that are causing it. I don't think cannabis is the only one. But like in cities like Barcelona, where there's 1,000 cannabis social clubs now, where they have the same kind of ethos that we're putting out there, where you have tested cannabis products, you label the percentages that are in them, the members are over 18 years old. Like when you've got those measures in place, I think the incidences of psychosis are probably going to reduce massively.
Okay.
I think
George
we need
Freeman,
to look at
Conservative, and then Norman.
The key word is probably, and I think it's really important to hear from a medic and to hear the case that we are scientific about this and we get the data. That's why I want a quick medical scheme, because then we get patients properly registered and we can collect the data. And it's very helpful and to be reminded that there is some horrible street cannabis out there, and there are people peddling horrible stuff that has really damaging effects on our young. As long as we regulate this as a medicine, we collect the data, we see what works, we get the evidence, then I think we're going to change the stigma, reduce this kind of cannabis is evil, and get it properly licensed. And that, I think, will open up a recreational debate. The truth is, we already lead the world in pharmaceutical cannabis. GW Pharma have invested billions in trying to develop pharmaceutical-grade products. My argument is that there's something in the middle, before pharmaceuticals, cannabis oils that are proven to help people with MS, with brain cancer. Those, I think, need to be regulated quickly and licensed.
Yes.
The critical question for me is this, Victoria. Given that this is a potentially dangerous product in its strongest, most potent strands, do we leave that in the hands of criminals? This provides no safety and security for my children. I'm a father, and I'm naturally quite hostile to drugs, certainly the overuse of drugs. I want them protected. But if your only source of supply is criminals on the street or the dark web, you have no idea what you're buying, and criminals have no interest in your welfare.
No.
So much better to regulate so that you can control the potency.
Let me read some messages from people who are watching you around the country. Ian from Newcastle sent this email. Dear Victoria, cannabis needs to be legalised for medical use ASAP. Alcohol has a far more devastating effect, as anyone working in A&E will confirm.
Absolutely.
As for recreational cannabis, whilst there is anecdotal evidence this may cause psychosis, the fact remains that thousands are being treated every day for such disorders, yet they've never smoked or taken cannabis. I would love to talk to you, Victoria, about my 25-year-old son who has intractable epilepsy. He is non-verbal, autistic, and has many other health problems. He's in desperate need of CBD oil, as he's already been on life support due to his seizures, and he's been hospitalised many times. Next time, he could die without this medication. I live in fear every day of the phone call telling me he's going to hospital. Please help these children and young adults, and that's from a desperate mum. And this texter who didn't leave their name, I'm ex-military, I'm in severe pain, I've used tramadol and every other drug to no effect. I've now used CBD for the past 9 months and will continue to do so regardless of the law. And it's fair to say that you can use CBD cannabis oil without breaking the law. It's the THC component, if it's above 0.2% in a particular amount, that causes the problems.
Victoria, on the medical case for THC, we already license opiates. So heroin is not a good product. Very few people think we should have recreational heroin. But we do use opiates in medicine, and indeed in cancer therapy, in pain relief. So we already have crossed this line of taking a evil substance, a highly addictive street heroin, and licensing it for medical use, and it works. And I think the case here is utterly compelling to do the same. We need to be evidence-led in terms of the recreational use and just see what the
We're going to talk
is.
about recreational, the pros and cons for recreational use in a moment. Yes, Molly Meacher.
In states in the US where they have legalised cannabis for medical use, the deaths from opioids have reduced by something like 67%.
Okay.
It is absolutely ridiculous that people are left on these very, very dangerous, very addictive opioids with terrible side effects when they could be on cannabis, much safer, less addictive, less side effects.
I'm going to bring in Jo. I actually just read Jo's email. Jo wants to talk to us about her son. Jo, whereabouts in the country are you? Good morning.
At the moment I'm in Northumberland, but I actually live in West Sussex.
Tell us about your son and his condition, Jo.
He's got Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. When he was a baby, he was having about 200 seizures a day. He's had brain surgery now twice. He's been on life support once. I never want to experience that again. It was horrendous.
And what do you want for your son?
I'd like to be able to access the CBD oil just to see if it helps him to improve his quality of life. And we don't have these hospital visits where we have to watch my son suffer so much.
Right. And have you considered breaking the law in order to get this?
No, not at the moment, because I'm quite law-abiding, so I'd be frightened to do that. But if I ever have to experience anything like that again, I wouldn't think twice about it. You have to see it. Last time I was in, I thought he was going to die. So I've done this funeral plan already for that time, because you just can't believe a body can go through such trauma and come out the other end.
Jo, thank you so much. A response here from people in the studio, yeah.
I was going to say, going back to the point, CBD itself is not illegal.
Yeah.
So I think by all means we should support parents who are in the same position to access it for these children. And I'm surprised neurologists are not actually taking part into the debate more, because if I were a pediatric neurologist, I'll be going in search of CBD oil myself. But again, we're talking about CBD being available, even THC under specific circumstances, and it's a different thing. Talk about cannabis, medicinal cannabis. Cannabis is a very dirty, wonderful plant, and I think we need to know. And all I want is actually information. And I think what concerns me is that who are pushing for the legalization keep saying that there are no harm associated with cannabis. There is no such a thing as a medicine who doesn't have side effect.
Nobody
So we
says
need
that.
to be aware of side effects as well as we are aware of medicinal
exactly. No one is
properties.
saying there is no harm, but it is much less harmful than the sort of drugs that are being prescribed every day by our doctors. Alfie's doctors here were prescribing a raft of adult medications, steroids and the rest of it, which were going to destroy his internal organs, cause him psychosis, and lead to an early death. Instead, he can take cannabis with a little bit of THC, which will be much, much less dangerous. I'm not saying, as you say, no drug is completely risk-free, but it's much less dangerous than the others.
We already do this in other drugs. We acknowledge that if someone's got terminal cancer, that threshold for drug safety is lower.
I totally agree.
And it's really important we have the evidence and the data.
I want to bring in. Sorry, Greg. Go on. You brief, because I'm going to bring in.
With legal CBD products, there's so many available on the market now, and no one really knows what's the right one to take for the patients. And these are children. These aren't like products made in GMP facilities that pharmaceutical medications are made in. They're made with hemp seed oil and CBD, and they're blended up. And while they might have like the percentage that's on it, they don't know what's the most effective dose for them. And the doctors need to work with those.
Greg, thank you.
I agree.
Joe, thank you so much for getting in touch with us. We really appreciate it. Wherever you are around the UK, do join the debate. Send us an email and we can talk to you on Skype and FaceTime. I'm going to introduce you to Ian, who's just arrived. Hello, Ian. Good morning to you. Thank you so much. Do take a seat. It's very good to see you. I don't want to ask about your journey, but I suspect it was pretty awful this morning. But thank you so much for getting here. Ian has Parkinson's, and you too have broken UK drugs laws by using cannabis to help your Parkinson's. How do you feel about that?
I feel that it should be available, basically. I shouldn't be in the position of having to break the law to get something that's effective and works for me.
Do you worry about saying on national TV that you've broken this?
Well, yeah.
Do
I'm a
you?
law-abiding citizen,
So that's why the law needs to change, so that we don't criminalise people like Ian. He's suffering from a condition and he needs to be able to get the medicines he needs.
Can you explain to our audience why you turned to cannabis to help your Parkinson's?
My main symptom is severe tremor in all four limbs. And I tried all the existing Parkinson's medications that only succeeded in making me feel ill and didn't affect my tremor. So I was researching natural tremor control on the internet. And I found instances of people who were treating it with cannabis. So I know someone who uses it recreationally, and I asked them to get me some to try. And it was like night and day.
Go on, what effect did it have on you?
Completely calmed the tremor within 10 minutes.
You did?
Is this oil or...?
This was the herb itself, the bud.
And how do you take it?
At that point I was smoking it. But these days I vaporise.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you for all your comments from around the country. We're going to talk about the recreational side of things and the arguments for and against. Having discussed the arguments for medicinal use of cannabis, the Home Secretary, as you know, Sajid Javid, insisting that such a move in terms of recreational legalisation is completely off the table. But is the debate inevitably moving in favour of full legalisation or not? Before we discuss that with you around the country, with our guest here in the studio, have a look at this, the arguments for and against. Cannabis is the most widely used illegal drug in Britain. Over 6% of 16 to 59-year-olds reported using it in 2017, according to Home Office statistics. It's a Class B drug, meaning it's illegal to supply or possess. Anyone found with it could face a warning, fine, or imprisonment. But for years, campaigners have called for it to be legalised, saying it's no more harmful than alcohol or tobacco.
We believe that the information is outdated, their reports and research is all very outdated. And if you take a look at Spain, Portugal, Canada, America, they're all coming through with progressive, forward-thinking policies that are basically providing more of a positive impact and utilising the cannabis culture for the positive it can do for the local community, for the industry, for medical patients, for recreational users that just want to have a social experience but not be criminalised for it.
Unexpectedly, the former Conservative leader William Hague is now also urging Theresa May to legalise its recreational use. He called the UK's drug policy utterly out of date, saying the government was deluded to think cannabis could be driven off the streets. Other politicians and campaigners agree.
I'm the mother of two sons, and I would far rather we were in a situation whereby if they were getting hold of cannabis, we would have a better chance of knowing that it was likely to be safer than going as we are today with the kind of free-for-all, where instead of this being regulated by the government. It's basically being regulated by gangs.
The government's now announced a review specifically into the use of medicinal cannabis, but it says there are no plans to either decriminalise the drug, in which possessing small amounts would no longer lead to a criminal record or jail sentence, or legalise it entirely.
This step is in no way a first step to the legalisation of cannabis for recreational use.
Those who support existing laws point to the higher risks of schizophrenia and other mental health conditions linked to cannabis, and fear for some people legalising it would act as a gateway to harder drugs. And it's probably worth just re-emphasising, growing, selling and possessing cannabis in all its forms is illegal in the UK and is punishable by law, the Home Office reminds us. Joseph is here. Joseph, good morning. Thank you for your patience. Your son has been smoking cannabis since the age of 14. He's now nearly 30. What effect has it had on him?
Well, when he was 14, we moved to a more affluent area, thinking that would actually help things, because we lived in a council house and everything else and what have you, and we found out that all the kids around there all smoked cannabis. So that's. Are you
saying it's a middle class thing then?
No, I'm not. I'm saying that it was more freely available there than probably where we were living. So, and the parents of those children seemed to be smoking it themselves as well, a lot of them. So, right. Anyway, so he started at that age. He was a good lad. Now, I'd like to say firstly that as far as the medical side of things is concerned, I don't see what the argument is. It's pretty obvious that it should be used, and politicians will probably take their time because that's what they do. But it should be done.
But the impact on your son of smoking over this time,
it's totally changed him. It's got to a position. He has a mental illness, a personal disorder, which means he has massive mood swings. He loses his temper very easily. We've had a lot of different episodes with different things, and it's gradually got worse and worse.
Has the cannabis exacerbated it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, he's spoken. The doctors have looked at him. We've had a situation where he was arrested, and we purely got him arrested so that he could be assessed. This is a totally different issue, but the police actually said to do this. Don't worry, don't press charges. Let's just get him assessed. The assessors came along after he'd spent all day in jail. He sat there, talked to him quite normally, and he said, "No, it's fine."
But your son has actually attacked you under the influence of cannabis.
Yeah, he has, and I think that's again because the ironic thing is now the only way that he can function is to take cannabis, because it's the only thing that actually now keeps him calm. Whereas now talking to the doctors, they're saying the reason that his condition is so bad is the cannabis, but the cannabis now is the only thing that can try. Totally addicted, he cannot go a day without having. He can't function.
Well, Simon Stevens, who's the head of the NHS in England, reminded us yesterday that 10% of people who use cannabis will become addicted, and he says legalising it would risk making children believing it's safe. Paul Attenborough, 30 years as a police officer, also worked with the drug squad. Do you agree with the head of the NHS? If you fully legalise cannabis, then you risk making children believing it's safe?
Yes. Basically, as a covert police officer, I've sat with people who have smoked cannabis, not realising that I'm a police officer, and I've seen the effect that it has on certain individuals. Not all, but certain individuals. So if there's a risk through that, then I believe that recreational use is a bad thing for the UK.
But do you think the drugs laws in this country do need some kind of reform? Because, as you will know, a number of police forces effectively turn a blind eye when it comes to individuals possessing cannabis.
We tried it in 2004. We declassified it to a Class C drug.
We didn't declassify it. We just moved it down. We downgraded it
to a Class C drug. Police officers were in a quandary. They didn't know what to do in relation to warning people on the streets with cannabis, whether they take it off people, how much they were allowed to have. So the education in relating to educating the police was very, very poor.
But what's the point of having the classification, a class place, if the police are not
doing? They've lowered priorities, but are they not enforcing it? I deal with cases every day as a drug expert, and I give evidence for the courts, and I see cannabis cases coming in the hundreds.
We're criminalising all those people
Yes.
for using a substance which we know is far less dangerous than alcohol. Alcohol, according to the scientists, is the most dangerous drug of all.
But why, when governments around the world are trying to stop people smoking and stop people binge drinking, would we add to this by legalising cannabis for recreational use?
We have too loose regulation over alcohol, and we go way over the top with a drug that is less dangerous. And actually, the way to protect people who use cannabis is to regulate it, to control the potency.
Why don't you give us your vision then, how it would work if Britain fully legalised cannabis? Who would manufacture it? Where would it be sold? Would it be in newsagents, supermarkets? Give us your vision.
So I would go exactly down the route that Canada has just legislated for yesterday.
That's right.
In fact. And you would have a regulated system where you'd have growers who would have to be registered
and licensed.
You'd have sellers that would have to be licensed. So if they're not fit and proper persons, they wouldn't get a license, or they would lose their license. And you would control the potency, this vital mix between the THC and the CBD. And if you get that right through regulation, you can limit the risk of anything going wrong.
Martin, what do you think of that?
I think potentially is a good idea. I've got two criticisms. One is the ideal concentration of THC and CBD, because I think we're beginning to understand what there might be, but we don't fully know, even Canada.
Can I just confirm, you're saying potentially it's a good idea to legalise it for recreational use?
No, potentially to look at having type of cannabis which have, an equal proportion.
Okay.
One thing I would like
I want to get to the end of the vision. And so it's you've controlled the compounds and all the rest of it. Where is it sold? How is it sold?
Like alcohol today, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, and it would be sold through registered outlets on the high street. I was in Victoria in British Columbia in Canada a couple of years ago. There's a very smart shop where it's all sold, set out neatly. This was before, incidentally, the legalisation, but the police were already accepting the reality of it. And then you take it off the streets. I mean, that's the critical thing.
Ideally, if you're going to tax it, though, know that would attract a black market because smugglers would want to undercut it.
But at least you're raising tax revenues, probably over £1 billion, which would be quite useful for our NHS, by the way.
The alcohol parallel is really important because, as Norman said, you basically put it in the same place as alcohol, which is a terrible problem. But at least you've decriminalised it, and government's getting revenue off it.
And
you've still got a problem, a massive problem.
What do you think about children growing up thinking, cannabis is safe then because it's legalised?
But cannabis at the moment is dangerous because you have no idea what you're buying. Prohibition.
But answer specifically. People growing up thinking cannabis is safe because it's legal.
No, you would absolutely be giving people education in schools about the potential risks of any drug, whether they are currently legal or illegal.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Janet in a moment, who's 70 years old and has smoked cannabis recreationally, or for recreational purposes, I think since her 20s. But before I do, I just want to read these comments from you around the country, if I can find them. Just bear with me with this.
I was never given alcohol education at school, like how to use alcohol safely. We see mass binge drinking. Like when I was 16 and we left school, everyone went out and got completely trolleyed, and they were all ill for a week.
And of course,
So you want another thing to have to educate kids about?
I think people actually should be educated. Like we should have a more open discussion about it. Like I don't think we speak about alcohol safely.
Over what we educate people about.
Exactly.
If people are using the drug, which they are, then we should tell them honestly.
Two people I want to talk to. Janet, who is being very patient on the phone, and also Lord Munson, who is with us. He's a Conservative peer, and he's going to tell us about his son, Rupert.
Sorry, can I correct something? I'm not a Conservative.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry.
I'm not in the House of Lords.
I beg your pardon. Tell us about Rupert, if you would.
Rupert's my second son. He told me he smoked cannabis and I wasn't bothered. He then became strange. He walked around the garden talking to imaginary people. That was a sort of pleasant side of things. That was okay, but then the demons came and his mother took him to the doctors, and they said that he had psychosis, and they thought it stemmed from his cannabis habit, which was quite a surprise to me. Anyway, the upshot of it was that he committed suicide in a psychotic fit in January. This is long after he'd stopped, 4 months after he'd stopped smoking cannabis. And then I was told by some doctors afterwards that what he'd been smoking was skunk. And I said, isn't skunk the same as cannabis? And they said, it's completely different to the cannabis that may have been around, with the greatest respect, Lord Munson, when you were a young man. And I looked it all up on the internet, and I was horrified to discover, in fact, it was 10 times stronger. My big concern is skunk is 3 to 5 times more likely to send you psychotic than the low-level cannabis. And so my particular line is, what do you do to get skunk off the street? And the way to get skunk off the street is the way they got moonshine whiskey, which was being peddled by gangsters in America between 1920 to 1932, and they got it off the street by ending prohibition and legalizing lower level alcohol. And then moonshine whiskey, with all its problems, just disappeared. So moonshine to me is like then it's like skunk now.
Understood. Okay, let me bring in Janet. Thank you. Janet, hello, good morning.
Morning.
Do you mind me asking how old you are?
I'm 70. I turned 70 last week.
And how long have you been smoking cannabis for?
I've been using cannabis since my 20s, really, and I've used it basically throughout my life. There have been some periods when I perhaps haven't used it so much, but certainly from the age of 40 onwards, I have used it. Incidentally, through that time, I've worked non-stop. I've worked from the age of 25 after I had my children right up until I retired not very long ago.
Right.
So I held down a professional job for years and years and years, and cannabis was my drug of choice to relax and unwind, and still is.
And still is. So for almost 50 years you've been using it. Do you think in your lifetime you will see it fully legalised in this country?
I would definitely think so. I don't think there's any way around it. I feel terribly sorry for the gentleman who spoke before me and his mentioning of the skunk. I'm well aware of the presence of this awful skunk on the street. And I completely agree with him that if it was properly regulated, you could completely get rid of that. People weren't getting psychosis from cannabis when, in the 60s and 70s. This is a human manufactured thing.
Yeah.
The natural cannabis is very safe. It isn't toxic. It helps people with different things like pain, nausea induced from chemotherapy and so on and
Janet,
so forth.
Joseph and Martha want to come in here and talk to you. Go ahead. Talk to Janet. You can't see her, but she's just on the phone, Joseph.
Yeah. Hi, Janet.
Hi.
I understand that there are a great many people that smoke cannabis and it has absolutely no effect on them at all. And there were 2 reasons what prompted me to contact Victoria. And one was obviously my son's case, that in his situation, there are obviously thousands of other kids in his situation. I don't know whether legalising it or not legalising it is going to make a difference, but it's a drug, and so it's obviously worrying.
Protected from those most potent strains.
I agree, but as I said, there were 2. The other point I wanted to make was that I actually contacted after the show had finished. I watched the show, and then William Hague came on television, and his reason for legalising cannabis is because the police can't enforce it. To me, after I'd stopped laughing, I decided to contact Victoria. If that's the politicians and his way of thinking, then why don't we legalise cocaine? Why don't we legalise anything that the police cannot actually...
That's not the right reason.
Sue,
but that was his reason.
Let Sue respond.
Yeah.
It's a different kind of thing. You don't legalise theft because there's a clear victim. But with drugs, it's a transactional crime, and both people want to commit the crime. The seller and the user want to commit the crime. it is still a crime in this country.
No, my point was being that he's given up. In his opinion, legalise it because we've given up. But if they hadn't slashed the police force's funds, perhaps they'd be able to do things they'd be able to do things better.
No, we cannot possibly police these drugs. We know we can't. We know by looking at the number of users.
The illegal drugs trade is associated with extreme violence, and often in the poorest communities.
Yes.
Because if you're supplying a community, the only way you can control your market is through threats and violence to others who try and get onto your market. And this upsurge in violence on our streets in London at the moment, there is a very close link with the illegal drugs trade.
Okay.
So let's take this violence out of our communities and regulate it properly.
All right, let me just...
There's a truth coming here, Victoria,
briefly.
Even if we regulate it like alcohol, we're still going to have a problem. And, the alcohol situation today, which is the model, is still, it's a disaster. We've got huge alcohol abuse. The real source of that is actually, we all ask ourselves, why have we got unhappy children? Why have we got people looking for an escape? So the really deep questions are societal. But at least if we regulated it, you'd take the wind out of the sails of the criminal gangs. You'd take the risk for
I think George
users.
is almost there. He's being persuaded.
Well, I think it's a debate that I welcome, and I think it's a really important to have it. But I don't think we should rush in on the back of the medical argument to say, let's have a cannabis free-for-all.
Okay.
I think we would regret it.
Might be a bit too black and white for you, but let me try it anyway. A show of hands for those who support the legalisation of cannabis for medicinal purposes. Well, that is everybody. So I wonder if that's a fair reflection of the way things are going. And those who support the legalisation of cannabis for recreational purposes. Okay, it's about half. Let me read these messages. Marie Ann texted in, my son began smoking cannabis from the age of 14. He quickly spiralled out of control. He became violent and abusive, especially towards me. He regularly hit me, which resulted in more than one trip to A&E. It totally changed his personality and it led to major anger issues. Cannabis then led to heroin. Cannabis is a very dangerous drug and should never be used for recreational purposes. Rory sent this text, I'm 37, I've been smoking cannabis for over 20 years. I have a good job, I run my own company. I'm healthy, I'm fit, I smoke every day, and I've never had a bad experience from using it. This is a topic I feel extremely passionate about. The UK recreational cannabis industry is worth over $1 billion a year, but our government would rather this money go to drug dealers and the black market. We need full licensing in this country now.
Do you think they're two different products? Your first caller has experienced skunk.
Well, we don't know. We don't know.
But they're very different products, aren't they?
It might be. It might not be.
That's my point.
Hang on.
In the room, though, when we're talking about skunk and we're talking about cannabis, they are the same thing, I'm afraid. Like GW Pharmaceuticals' genetic library that they grow is skunk. It's bought from the breeder of Skunk Man Sam.
Okay.
He is the creator of the skunk strain. That's what GW Pharmaceuticals are using to make Sativex.
Okay,
which is to make Epididiolex.
Yeah.
So
Sativex is CBD.
It's CBD and THC, two strains from skunk genetics.
It's licensed, it's regulated.
You're not surely saying we should have recreational skunk?
It is like most.
You are saying
the
that.
same cannabis that I use for medicine is the same cannabis that people are using on the streets.
Okay, and one more.
It's the same cannabis that's been regulated in America and it's being sold in dispensaries out there.
Okay.
The term skunk is just a scare word over
All
here.
right, and this emailer who doesn't leave their name, I know that my 17-year-old son and many of his friends use cannabis rather than drinking alcohol, and this seems common amongst young people. It's interesting that he is worried that if it's legalised and regulated, he will find it hard to get hold of, whereas at the moment he says it's so easy. Right, thank you, all of you.
It's what's happened in schools in America, though. It's harder for kids to get hold of cannabis because it takes 21-year-old age ID to get it. Now,
and Justin Trudeau has said exactly the same thing. Protect our kids by legislating and regulating.
Thank you all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Really appreciate you getting here. Some of you, thank you for your patience as well. Thank you.
I smoke cannabis. I smoke